He was dead at 32. He had never lost a battle, and in his final years, he executed the people closest to him. History calls him Alexander the Great. Military academies still study his tactics. Civilizations still remember his name. But almost nobody asks the only question that actually matters. What happens to a human mind when it gets everything it wants before the age of 30? Because here is what the history books miss. Alexander did not psychologically collapse because he conquered too little. He collapsed because conquest stopped giving him anything he could emotionally keep. Victory only means something if there is someone left who can share it with you. And by the time Alexander reached the edge of the known world, there was no one left. There is a psychological pattern that appears in extreme high achievers. Therapists encounter it constantly, but history rarely talks about it. When a person builds their identity entirely around achievement, every victory quietly destroys the ability to feel satisfied by the last one. The threshold for fulfillment keeps moving. Higher, further, more impossible. And eventually, the goal is no longer success. It is escape. Here is what nobody tells you about raising someone to believe they are destined for greatness. It works. The belief becomes architecture. Every decision, every relationship, every risk, filtered through one question. Is this worthy of who I am supposed to become? And when the answer is almost never yes, the world begins feeling very small. Alexander learned this young. At 13, he was taught by Aristotle himself, not simply philosophy, but the idea that human beings should fully actualize everything they are capable of becoming. Alexander took that idea literally, and once he began conquering, he could never psychologically return to being ordinary again. By 326 BC, Alexander had conquered Egypt, Persia, Central Asia, and reached India. No human being had ever achieved anything remotely comparable, and with every victory, the distance between Alexander and everyone around him widened. His generals began recognizing him less. His closest companions no longer understood him. And perhaps most dangerously, Alexander himself stopped understanding where ambition ended and identity began. After conquering Persia, he adopted Persian robes, Persian ceremonies, Persian court rituals. He demanded his Macedonian generals bow before him in the Persian style. They refused. Historians describe this as political strategy, but psychologically, something deeper was happening. Alexander had evolved into someone the people who loved him could no longer emotionally recognize. And then came Clitus. In 328 BC, during a banquet in Samarkand, Alexander murdered his closest friend, Clitus the Black, the man who had once saved Alexander's life in battle. They argued. Clitus accused him of arrogance, of forgetting who he used to be. Alexander picked up a spear and drove it through him, not dramatically, not strategically, emotionally. And afterward, the most powerful man alive locked himself inside a tent for 3 straight days, refusing food, refusing water, calling his friend's name. This was not a man incapable of love. This was a man whose emotional intensity had outgrown his ability to control it. There was one person who still seemed capable of understanding Alexander, Hephaestion, his closest companion since childhood. When Hephaestion died, Alexander psychologically shattered. He ordered horses across the empire to have their manes cut in mourning, destroyed nearby cities in grief, and launched military campaigns simply to give his pain somewhere to go. Because here is the paradox. Alexander's life makes impossible to ignore. The psychological machinery that made him capable of conquering the known world was the exact same machinery that made it impossible for him to peacefully exist inside it. The relentless ambition, the inability to stop, the identity built entirely around becoming instead of being. These are not merely the traits of a conqueror. They are the traits of a man running from something fast enough to build an empire before it caught him. And eventually, it did. In 326 BC, Alexander's army reached the Hyphasis River, and for the first time in his life, his men refused to follow him further. The legend says Alexander wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. That is not what happened. The historical sources describe something colder. Alexander locked himself inside his tent for 3 days. Again, refusing to speak, waiting for his army to surrender to his will. They did not. And for the first time in history, Alexander encountered something he could not conquer: the limits of other human beings. You do not need to conquer Persia for this psychology to recognize you. Think about the last time you achieved something significant, and how quickly the satisfaction disappeared, how fast the mind moved the goal forward, how difficult it became to sit still afterward. Most people eventually stopped chasing. Alexander could not, because stopping would have forced him to confront whatever existed underneath the ambition. And perhaps that is why history still remembers him, not because he conquered the world, but because he revealed something terrifying about human nature. The drive that takes human beings to extraordinary heights and the ability to feel peace once they arrive there are almost never found inside the same person. Alexander died at 32 in Babylon. The cause is still debated, but the generals who spent 13 years beside him all said the same thing afterward. In all that time, they never once saw him at rest. Power shapes history. Human nature repeats it. Subscribe to Empire Psychology for cinematic documentaries exploring power, ambition, collapse, and the hidden psychology behind history.